legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Neil McDonald, who joins us to discuss some of the wonders and mysteries of megalithic culture. A megalith is a large stone that has been used to construct a structure or monument, either alone or together with other stones. Stonehenge is arguably the best known megalithic site in the world. There are over 35,000 in Europe alone, located widely from Sweden to the Mediterranean. Their historic timeline extends from the Mesolithic and Neolithic Stone Age eras. Some of the earliest sites date from around 10,000 BC, right through to the Bronze Age. The megalithic tradition in general came to an end around 1200 BC. Megaliths were used for a variety of purposes, ranging from boundary markers, reminders of past events, burial sites, to being part of the society's religion. Some also have various stellar and solar alignments. However, many questions about their origin and purpose remain unanswered, not least the methods of their construction. If the stones could speak, they could tell us much about humanity's history that is still obscure. Hello and welcome, Neil, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, hi, Greg. Thank you very much for inviting me on. I appreciate it.
Today we're just going to be having a little bit of a megalithic chat, because that's one of your areas of expertise. Before we get started, for the benefit of listeners who don't know, just give them a little potted bio about yourself and your work.
Okay. Well, I come from a northern English council estate, working class background, which was great. Through school, absolutely hated it, so kind of avoided that with every bit of judgment I possibly could, and worked as a psychiatric nurse for 14 years after school. That's where I got interested in the whole idea of the subconscious and the power of the mind, all that sort of thing. Left, went to university, got a degree. That was when I was 30, early 30s. Then worked as a financial advisor. I was very naive. I was really into economics, and I thought financial advisors were there to help people. That didn't last that long. I found out the truth of that pretty quick. And then a little bit of time in property developing, and then 20 years ago, on the 28th of February, just gone, 20 years ago, I left work and I began doing tours to ancient mystical sites, megalithic tours, and I've loved every minute of it since.
Now, I came across your work via a regular radio guest of mine, Thomas Sheridan. Many of the listeners will be familiar with the shows that he and I have done together. And you and he, in recent months, have been doing a YouTube series called Megaliths and Mysteries, and I'd really recommend that to anybody listening if that sounds like your bag. So where did the interest in, when we say megaliths here, all we're really talking about there is a large piece of stone, but people use megaliths as a kind of shorthand for all sorts of monuments and stone circles, monoliths, other structures from mostly the Neolithic period. But in general, what was it that captured your imagination about that period in history?
Where it really started was I had an interest in the ancient mystic tradition through mystery schools and things. So I'd studied that for many years, and I was a member of a group in Preston, and the sort of group where you do talks every Friday night, that sort of thing. So I said, well, I'll organise a tour to the Lake District to see the ancient sites, and I'd never actually seen any. This was all brand new to me. So I drove up. I got a book. I got the Modern Antiquarian, Julian Cope's book, from Waterstones, which was recommended to me by Kay Waterstones, which is where it all started.
It's an excellent book, that, isn't it? It really is excellent. It's such a beautiful book as well.
It's the Bible. If you're going to start into megaliths, that's absolutely wonderful book. And Julian goes into so much detail and poetry as well about the whole thing. He really brings it alive, puts his own emphasis on it. So yeah, I would definitely go for that if you're starting out. So I headed up to the Lake District, and I think I went to Long Meg first, which is a huge stone circle near Penrith. And I drove in, and I think I was transformed. I just had to sit down and all these questions, it was a shock, really. It was a real eye-opener. So why, when, who, all these huge questions came flowing into me. And so I put the whole tour together, and I haven't stopped since. That was one experience 20 years ago, and until last year, obviously, I've just been on the road and never stopped.
For me, my interest, I think, started, I think I saw, just a documentary it was a documentary about druids, and it had this connection with places like Stonehenge, which is quite spurious, really. There isn't really, as I understand it, any real basis for that. But the point was that it still showed these megalithic sites in this program. And I was just fascinated because there was so much conjecture in the show about, this is back in the early 80s, about what the purpose of these sites might be. And many different, some of them were obvious, fairly practical purposes. Others were, a complete mystery, and they remain so. But in general, I've found with history that when I was learning history at school, and we were doing particular periods in, Napoleonic Wars or, whatever it happened to be, I found it all very dry. And everything that's in the past is kind of inherently interesting in a way. But for me, I found the periods of time about which we know the least to be most fascinating. It's almost that the less we know about a period of time, the more interesting it is to me.
That's definitely true, isn't it?
And the period of time we're talking about here loosely, as I said, it's mostly the Neolithic. There are some megalithic sites dating prior to that time through into the Bronze Age. And although there are still one or two megalithic cultures that exist in the world even today, I think it's the Neolithic through into the Bronze Age, isn't it really? If people are wanting to get a handle on how this sits in the broader sweep of history.
Yeah, these are the dates that you look at, sort of the Neolithic, sort of 5,000-6,000 years ago. I mean, I'm not absolutely sure about the dates, to be honest. I think, I'm a bit sceptical about it, but that's the sort of authentic idea. So you're looking at the hunter-gatherers in the Mesolithic, and then in the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age, they call it the agricultural revolution, and then they started building stone monuments. And that went to about 2000 to 1500 BC, which was the Bronze Age, through to the Iron Age. But what you say about school is important, because the bits of history I did see it was kind of woolly mammoth, saber-toothed tiger, Romans.
Yes.
And our early ancestors, which are fascinating, didn't even get a look in.
No, you're absolutely right. There was no, I grew up in Ireland, albeit in the north, so that's the United Kingdom, but there was nothing about the history of these islands in these sorts of time periods. It's almost like Britain only, in our history timelines, Britain only became interesting, according to our teachers, when the Romans arrived.
Yeah, it's that period. I think everything's shone through the eyes of the church, isn't it, really? I mean, you can't have anything. Well, the idea was that the Earth was built 6,000 years ago, so you couldn't really have anything of any importance 7,000 years ago, because there was no Earth. And anything before the church, which was kind of the Roman time, it isn't really worth looking at.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things there. One is, the history being written by the victors, if you see what I mean, so any culture that comes to dominate others gets to write history. And then there's also the act of writing in itself. And there have been many human cultures that haven't, for whatever reason, before the development of writing, whatever it happens to be, they haven't recorded their own culture in a way that has survived. I mean, even, Roman culture we know a great deal about, but there's huge gaps even in that. I mean, as I understand it, as our knowledge of Roman music consists of like about 1 or 2 bars, and that's it. So, so there's huge gaps there. So I understand, I alluded to this a few minutes ago, there are great periods of history about which we can say very little, but it's not like there's nothing to say, and there's still a lot that we can glean about the history of the British Isles in particular, what you and I are mostly concerned with, although of course you travel around Europe to other megalithic sites, but there's still a lot that can be said based on, what has been left behind.
Yeah, I think travelling around the sites is motorbike there. Yeah, travelling around the sites is, the more you do it, the more you kind of build up a picture in your mind. So when I started travelling and doing the tours, I didn't realise that the megalithic thing was a thing, if you see what I mean, because I went down to Glastonbury to the Megalithomania conference, and I just thought, I didn't realise this was a huge kind of organisation around it. So I kind of went into it sort of bare, if you know what I mean. And so what I've ended up doing is picking up ideas about the culture, whether they're right or not, I don't know. But and I see the British megaliths pretty much as something like a holy centre, like a place of pilgrimage, because they differ so. An island as well as the Ireland and Britain as one sort of pilgrimage centre, because they're so much different than all the other areas, apart from northern France and Brittany, which I think was part of it. But they are different than the other megaliths on the other parts of Europe. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. And I think we've got, am I correct in saying that also in the British Isles we've got like the largest collection of the concentration of these sorts of sites anywhere in the world?
Absolutely, yeah, and particularly over in the Republic of Ireland, because they haven't been built on to the same extent as we have. So I think we have lost so much under sort of Manchester, Leeds, well, more of the West really, but Manchester, Liverpool, all this sort of thing. And I mean, the whole idea, I don't like to mention the A word, but the whole Atlantis thing, it interests me, and I wonder whether it's a throwback to that sort of period, because we have got this massive, and they're not only individual sites, they all seem to be to have processional ways sort of connected to them, as if people would travel there, if you see what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's rather gives a lie to the idea that people didn't move around thousands of years ago. We often, we talk about in the medieval period, and people wouldn't travel more than, 20 miles from their village or whatever in a whole lifetime. But clearly, there's evidence in high antiquity of people moving very large distances by whatever means, sometimes over land, sometimes by sea.
Absolutely. I mean, we know pretty certain that there was Neolithic trade from around the Malta area up to the western fringe of Britain. And then you've got these huge, I mean, the Stonehenge obviously is the first one, and with Durrington walls, that's the thing that springs to mind. It was definitely a place of pilgrimage, because they know that there were certain animals slaughtered at certain times of the year, and then they would probably then marched up down the processional way from like Woodhenge to Stonehenge. But there are things in the north, like the Thornborough henges, where you've got 3 massive henges, supposedly, which are pretty much definitely aligned on Orion's belt. Now, each one of those stone circles can hold 2,000 people, and there's about 20 miles of alignment of henges, most of which have gone, that ends up with the Devil's Arrows near, well, they're about 20 miles south, between the Rivers of Air and the other one I can't remember. But that just shows that if that wasn't a few people, and to get 6,000 people to pilgrimage to one particular site, that shows that, well, there must have been thousands and thousands of people. Yeah. And that's the sort of thing that gives me the idea that they would have come to these islands for a particular reason.
Yeah, and when you consider what global populations were, in the thousands of years BC, just vanishingly small compared to anything we could even imagine now. So if you had a gathering of several thousand people, that would probably, I don't know what that would be the equivalent of now. It would be like a gathering of several million, I suppose, in terms of, percentage.
Yeah, so there must have been a huge pull, a huge magnetic pull to get people to make that journey. And it must have been from mainland Europe. I mean, the same thing happens in Brittany, but I think that was connected to Britain then. And there's one across near me, up in the Lake District, where there was a stone circle, and there used to be a massive pilgrimage avenue like the one at Avebury up to another site on a hill, and that's pretty much all gone now. But you see, these things they're all over the place.
Yeah. So, what you mentioned there a moment ago is worth just emphasizing, that it's not that long ago that the west of France, the northwest of France, was connected to the southeast of England. It was walkable. It's a long time ago for you and I, but not that long ago in terms of, geologic history. And you look at something, I remember being struck when I was reading about the stones and whatnot, the earthworks at Karnak, and I was absolutely blown away by the scale of that. And it did seem to have more of a connection in some ways with similar features in what are now separate British Isles.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it was 8,000 years ago, wasn't it, that the last sort of mini ice age supposedly disappeared or melted. And I think I can't remember if it was 8,000 years ago or 8,000 BC. I think it's 8,000 years ago. So that's when the huge weight of glacial pressure on Scotland disappeared because the ice melted, which lifted the landmass up, and that had the sort of the effect of lowering the land to the south, and that's when we got the English Channel was flooded. So it was actually connected up. And there's some work. I've just dragged it off the shelf now. Not long ago, I just can't see her name. My eyes are terrible. Can't see it. Actually, it was explaining. She's called Schultz Paulson, and she radio-carbon dated massively around the Brittany area, and it more or less proved that the whole idea of the people travelling and building the sites from the south of Europe was wrong, because it pretty much started around the Karnak area. So that kind of turns everything on its head. But I know what you mean about. I remember I travelled around Britain for so long, and then when I went to, you kind of got an idea in your head of what's right. And then I went down to Karnak and just saw it, and it just blows your brain. You think, oh my God, start again.
Exactly.
It's magnificent, isn't it?
Excuse me. Now, you mentioned the A word there a few moments ago, Atlantis, which I wouldn't be shy about, because a lot of people just roll their eyes. But yeah. I think that even if out of, Greek scholars came a mythologized or even completely fictional account of something, I think it connects with, in some way, actual species memory, and it may be connected with the idea of the deluge, because the flood myths are universal across the world, reflected
Absolutely.
Reflected again in the idea of the biblical flood. So, and this is not again, you can start to look at possible reasons for this, and certainly the ending of an ice age, you're looking at massively increased sea levels globally, and that could have happened in a relatively short space of time. So you could have seen a lot of, potentially tsunamis, inundation of lands being completely lost that are still underwater. I mean, Doggerland off the west of Ireland, for example, is sometimes connected with Atlantis myths. And I was recently reading, or rather I was reminded of the little known or talked about phenomenon in megalithic circles, which is the USO, the unidentified sunken object. And there's, we have megalithic objects and sites that have been submerged now for thousands of years. Taking all of that together, if you want to use the word Atlantis, fine. If you don't, but I still think there's something there. There's a story to be told there, to be uncovered, which we may never be able to do. But I don't think it's all made up.
No, I don't either. I think that everything that is kind of a myth now came from somewhere. Where I don't think things are just made up on the spot. For instance, Stampton, if you know the Stampton Drewstone circles down near Bristol, they're called the weddings. Now, why would you just make that up? But I can imagine that maybe, and people still get handfasted there now. So so it's like a tradition. Every folklore must have started for some reason at some time. I was talking about the processional idea again. I remember when we were brought up in Preston, where I am now, the local church, they had the May Queen every year, and she would go to church and she would get a little ceremony and she'd become that for the year. And then we would all sit on the back of lorries and we'd go for a drive round. And then we'd end up at the village hall. Now, to me, that's exactly the same thing as processional way between two ancient sites that could have been 6,000 years ago. Because everything starts at some point, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's a very common thing in many cultures around the world, the idea of a ceremonial procession from one point to another point. And somebody might say, oh, well, they're just going from A to B for a practical reason, or maybe they're just taking someone's body from where they live to the place where they're going to be buried. But it's still a very common feature, and for all sorts of reasons. And it seems to be very important for some reason. And I guess it's just part of a ceremony, isn't it, really?
Well, you've got these amazing processional ways like the Camino, haven't you? They go for miles and miles. But I think it's a real thing. I mean, I go down to the Cathar country every year, apart from last year. But the Cathar country, you can fly into Carcassonne and you're there. But I like to take the minibus down. I want to drive all the way just because it gives me that feeling of pilgrimage, and you feel like when you've arrived there, you've put yourself through an experience, if that makes sense. Yeah,
I mean, I've worked in a church in the past, and at a certain time of the day, let's say evensong, silence falls, bells ring, incense is lit, and the vergers and the clergy appear in their robes and with their banners, and it's all very solemn and grand, and and then they make their way along, and people stand respectfully in silence. It's
all part of making something an occasion, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that, I guess that we've been touching upon anyway, that could bring us on to the purpose of some of these sites. And as I mentioned at the top of the hour, some of them are clearly practical. Maybe they're graves. Maybe they're just monuments marking a special spot. But it's fascinating to me how discussion, and no doubt this went on for a century before I was even born, but when I first got interested in megalithic culture and societies, how the discussion about the purpose of many of these sites really hasn't changed in the last few decades.
I think the problem with a lot of, which not only in archaeology, I think it's in every subject, that you get an idea, and a certain professor will will do his PhD, he'll get his job, he'll get a job in a a museum, and he'll build this huge career. So the chance of actually changing it whilst he's alive is impossible, isn't it? Because you're stuck with that idea. When I did the Malta book, I found lots of they basically based the whole dating of the whole dating on about 2 or 3 radiocarbon dates, and we know that they can be just find a bit of organic material that might have been put there 5,000 years after the I mean, somebody finds a Coke can there now, if they find it in 100 years, they're not going to say it was built in 2020. So it's like you can only, these ideas get fixed, and you can't move on until they say that prehistory's only moved on with the death of a professor. So the ideas are stuck. We talked about the church and 6,000 years old. Now you've got Göbekli Tepe in what's the name of the place? But that's the site they found in Turkey. That's now you're looking at 9,000 BC or even 12,000 BC. So that just puts a light to the whole thing. So I think the whole dating thing is up for grabs. It started because of this idea of the church, but nobody will ever question it, because you're taught it at university, you become an archaeologist, and you just carry the myth on.
Yeah, Egyptology is notorious for that kind of blinkered thinking and tenured professors and vested interests and research grants and all. That's probably the worst area of it. But you're talking again about dating, and I really agree with you on that. As just a non-expert, but you're probably familiar with some of the work of Graham Hancock.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When he posts online, he's got a little series that he'll regularly do, and it starts out with stuff. Basically, if it was called anything, you could call it "Stuff Just Keeps Getting Older." So Graham Hancock, social media, stuff just keeps getting older, and then he links to a news story or a new bit of research which is revising the dating of these things. Yeah, I think he's got a very good point. I think we've been conservative about the dating for a long time, and about the abilities of those who came before us. Göbekli Tepe being a perfect example. When I first read about it, it was 9,000 years. And then, I've read stuff as well, now taking it to 12,000 BC, which is staggering. And as Hancock has pointed out, we're told that there's hunter-gatherers who built this stuff. Well, maybe is how they lived. Maybe they did roam around, picking berries and killing a wild boar here and there. But the fact is that whatever they were eating or whatever they were wearing, somehow that structures like this got built. And if people are not familiar with Göbekli Tepe, just Google it and have a look. It's a massive series of sites, I suppose. Absolutely incredible.
It is amazing, isn't it? And they had the logistics in position. Just shooting up to Orkney, where I used to be absolutely amazed about the Ring of Brodgar, because they think there's a huge stone circle, massive, beautiful stone circle, and there's a little henge around it, but the henge is actually carved out of the solid bedrock. Now, I used to be amazed that they would have the logistics and the manpower and everything in position to be able to put that time into a project so massive. Yet since then, we found they've discovered the Ness of Brodgar, which looks like a little city underneath it's just basically underneath the grass, about 4 or 5 football pitches big. They think it's going to take a couple of 100 years to dig down. So there must have been a lot of people with enough food, water, settlements to live in. All that must have been taken care of.
Yeah, because I find it hard to credit that you would have people basically sleeping in a cave, or maybe if they were living in Turkey, sleeping under a tree if it was nice and warm, and then getting up having a few berries and getting up in the morning and excavating, 100-ton plus blocks of solid stone and all these intricate carvings and doing what even today, if it could be done, would take decades.
It doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, it just doesn't make any... Just looking at it with common sense, it doesn't make any... It doesn't seem right. I mean, if they were hunter-gatherers, they wouldn't have enough time to build a stone city. Would you do it at the weekends? It just wouldn't work like that, would it?
No, and you have to move if you're hunter-gatherers, because, obviously they didn't, they lived in a very sustainable way. They didn't exhaust resources, but they tended to need to keep moving because, that one of the things that agriculture allowed human societies to do was to remain in place, to become static and to construct settlements. Hunter-gatherers were on the move. And that militates against achieving something monolithic, in one location.
Yeah, it just can't be right. And then if they did shoot off on pilgrimages at other times, I mean, I would imagine that. And then they buried Göbekli Tepe as well, didn't they?
Yes, that's one of the most fascinating things about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever come across the work of Robert Schoch. He's the geologist who has attracted controversy by his own redating of the Great Sphinx in Egypt to be much older than we believe it to be. But it was in one of his books that I first discovered about Göbekli Tepe being buried. Now, what that was all about, it was something I was going to get onto later, actually. But, we're here now. We might as well get to it. He speculated that the reason for this was to protect the site for the future. It's like, we cannot use this. It's basically like you would mothball an office block. It was like, we're going to bury this site to protect it for the future, and there's a reason why we can't use it. Now, it's not we've grown bored with it. It's not like putting a Christmas present into the back of the wardrobe, because you're bored with it. And the speculation was that there was some threat to the site, some threat to humans, some threat to the planet. Something caused them to do this.
There's a lot of... This is everywhere, isn't it? I mean, Malta, again, the structures, I don't know if you've seen the temples on Malta, but there's nothing like them on the planet. And they were pretty much earlier than, well, they were dated earlier than our stone circles, obviously not as far back as Göbekli Tepe, but maybe 8,000 years old. And these are really sophisticated buildings that were built onto the bedrock. They were because Malta's a rock and there's not really any soil. You couldn't really dig down, so they built these amazing structures just to stand on the top of the actual bedrock. Now, they were there for 1,000 years, and then suddenly gone. Everybody just disappeared. There's no sign why they went. There's theories, but no theories seem to make any real sense. And then again, we'll talk about Orkney. The same thing, about 2,500 BC. Everybody disappeared. So why did this happen? Why did it happen at Göbekli Tepe? It's a mystery that we don't have the answer to at all, really. Unless there was some huge, some sort of deluge of water. But would you have enough water? Well, there's only a certain amount of water on the planet. So it wouldn't stretch from Orkney down to Turkey. And it's one of those mysteries that I don't think we'll ever answer, unless you've got any ideas.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com